Eleanor Whitmore dropped to her knees in the front yard of a dying ranch and drove her bare hands into the earth like a woman who had nothing left to lose, because she didn't. The decorative gravel Caleb Dawson had spent 3 months laying scattered around her, rolling into the dirt, and she didn't stop. She dug until her fingers hit something the man who owned this land had been too proud to see. Rich, dark soil. The best farmland in Red Creek, buried under rocks arranged to impress people who would never save him. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something in your chest, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far the story has traveled. Every single comment means the world to me, and I read every one. Now let's go back to Wyoming Territory, 1884, and meet a woman nobody expected, and nobody forgot. Eleanor had known, even before the wagon stopped rolling into Red Creek, that she was not what Caleb Dawson had pictured when he sent that letter to the agency in St. Louis. She had read his letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He had written plainly, without warmth, without flattery, without a single word that might have been confused for kindness. He needed a woman who could keep records, cook for 2, maybe 3 hands, manage supply costs, help him bring a failing cattle operation back from the edge before the bank finished what the drought had started. He had not mentioned what she should look like. He had not mentioned romance. He had mentioned once, near the bottom of the page in handwriting that leaned hard to the right like a man bracing against wind, that he was not looking for a companion. He was looking for a partner in survival. Eleanor had folded that letter back along its soft creases and thought, "That is the most honest thing any man has ever written to me." She was 26 years old. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, heavy-hipped, with hands that had known hard work since she was old enough to reach the stove, and eyes that had learned to read a room faster than most people read a sentence. She had grown up in a Missouri household where her mother worked herself to the bone, keeping 7 children fed, where money was a conversation held in whispers after the younger ones went to sleep, and where Eleanor had discovered early that the world treated a woman of her size as either invisible or inconvenient. She had stopped expecting the world to see her clearly. She had started instead learning how to see it. The wagon driver said nothing when they crossed into Wyoming Territory. The landscape shifted around them like something alive and impatient. Wide open country that seemed to dare you to be small. Eleanor pressed her travel bag against her side and watched the horizon the way she had always watched people, looking for the truth that lived just underneath what was being shown. Red Creek was the kind of town that had arrived fast and intended to stay. There were 3 saloons, a general store, a post office, a church that hadn't been finished on the inside, and enough people standing on enough wooden boardwalks to make Eleanor feel the full weight of being a stranger. The wagon slowed. People looked up. People looked at her. She had learned to hold her chin level when that happened. A man stepped down from the boardwalk in front of the post office. He was taller than she expected, lean in the way that men who worked too hard and ate too little always got lean, with a jaw that seemed to be permanently set against something, dark eyes that moved quick and gave nothing away, and the kind of dusty coat that told you he had ridden a long distance and not slept much afterward. He walked toward the wagon with his hat in his hands, which Eleanor thought was either genuine courtesy or practiced politeness, and she had not yet decided which. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Mr. Dawson," she said, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She saw it then. The flicker that crossed his face. The one she had seen on so many faces before. It lasted less than a second. A brief rearrangement of expectation. The moment when the picture a person had built in their mind collided with the reality standing in front of them. He recovered quickly. She gave him credit for that. Some men didn't recover at all. "I'll take your bag," he said. "I've got it," she said. He didn't argue. That was the first thing he did right. They rode in silence most of the way to the ranch. Eleanor had brought 3 questions she intended to ask before they arrived. About the livestock count, about the condition of the soil, about what bills were most overdue. But she set them aside when she noticed how tightly Caleb's hands were wrapped around the reins. There was something in the way he held himself that reminded her of a door braced from the inside. Whatever was happening at that ranch, he was not ready to talk about all of it yet. She could wait. She had learned that rushing a proud man only made him lock tighter. The ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road, and Eleanor felt the contradiction of it hit her like something physical. The front yard was beautiful. She had not expected that. A man described in his own letter as one bad season from losing everything had built a front yard that looked like it belonged to a prosperous family in a catalog photograph. Smooth white gravel laid in careful lines. A low border fence made of the same wood as the house, freshly whitewashed. Decorative stones arranged around a space that had once, she guessed, held flowers. Two large ornamental rocks near the entrance, like a statement about permanence. The house behind it looked tired. The paint on the shutters was flaking. The porch had a board missing on the left side. The whole structure leaned slightly in the way that buildings leaned when they had been fighting weather alone for too long. But the yard was immaculate. Caleb did not volunteer an explanation. He helped her down from the wagon. She let him this time, because she was watching his hands, the way he moved, the way he looked at the yard with something that wasn't pride exactly, but was close enough that she recognized it. And he carried her bag up the porch steps without speaking. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the specific quiet of a place that had been lived in by only one person for a long time. Eleanor set her coat over the back of a chair and looked around the kitchen. It was orderly in the way of a man who had no patience for disorder, but no real feeling for comfort. Everything was where it needed to be. Nothing was where it might have made someone happy. A woman named Nora Hensley, who ran the general store and considered it her personal responsibility to know the business of everyone within 15 miles, had taken it upon herself to prepare a small supper and leave it on the stove before Eleanor arrived. There was a note on the counter in round handwriting that said, "Welcome to Red Creek. Hope you know what you're taking on." Eleanor read it twice, set it back on the counter, and thought, so do I. Over that first supper, Caleb talked about the ranch the way a man talked about a legal proceeding. Organized, sequential, stripped of emotion. The cattle herd had been 36 head 2 years ago. It was now 19. The drought had killed the feed crops 2 seasons back. He had taken a loan from the bank in Cheyenne to cover the winter, and that loan was due in full in 7 months. His 2 ranch hands, a man named Holt, who had been with the family since Caleb's father ran the place, and a younger hand named Dawes, who was more goodwill than competent, were staying on without full pay because there was no full pay to give them. Eleanor listened and counted in her head. She asked 2 questions. The first was about the road beyond the front yard. How much wagon traffic moved past daily? Caleb told her it had increased considerably since the railroad camp set up 3 miles east. Hundreds of workers, supplies moving constantly, families following the line into the territory. Her second question was about the soil under the front yard gravel. Caleb put his fork down. "Why would you ask about that?" he said. "Because something grew there once," she said. "I can see the shape of it. What was it?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother had a garden there," he said. "Before she passed. Grew half our vegetables through the summer. When she died, my father—" He stopped, started again. "My father covered it over. Said looking at it was too much." Eleanor nodded. She didn't say anything. She picked up her fork again and finished her supper, and she let the quiet sit there between them without trying to fill it, which was something most people were not willing to do. That night, lying awake in the small room at the back of the house, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and did arithmetic. She counted what they had and what they owed, and what the land might produce if it was given the chance. She counted the wagons that had rolled past on that road while they were eating supper. She counted the months until the banknote was due, and then she made a decision. Not all at once, the way people made decisions in stories, but quietly, the way she always made decisions, by accepting the truth of a thing before anyone else was ready to. The front yard was going to have to go. She did not tell Caleb this in the morning. She started by walking the perimeter of the ranch alone in the early gray light before anyone else was stirring. She moved slowly, the way she always moved when she was thinking hard. her big frame steady and deliberate through the damp grass, her eyes moving across everything with the patient attention of someone who had learned that the thing you weren't looking at was usually the thing that mattered. She walked the edge of the yard. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the earth beside the gravel border. She stood back up and looked at the road. She stood there for a long time. Holt found her there when he came out to start the morning chores. He was a weathered man in his 60s with a face that had been negotiating with Wyoming winters for decades and a disposition that seemed permanently set somewhere between resignation and dry humor. He pulled up short when he saw her, then touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture so automatic it seemed like breathing. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Morning," she said. "How many wagons came through yesterday between sunrise and noon?" Holt blinked. "I don't rightly know. Didn't count." "Start counting today," she said. "Every wagon, every rider that slows down, every time someone looks toward the house." Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the yard. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one held back. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went on about his work. She counted herself too. By midday, she had marked 31 wagons and riders passing along that road. Of those, she guessed from their pace and their loads that at least 20 were workers from the railroad camp or supply teams moving toward it. She thought about what those men ate. She thought about what they couldn't carry and what they'd be willing to pay for if they could stop and buy it without going out of their way. She was still standing there when Caleb came looking for her. "You planning to take root beside the road?" he said. There was no sharpness in it, just the bluntness of a man who communicated mainly in direct statements. "I'm planning to build a stand," she said. He squinted. "A stand." "Right here, off the road. Vegetables, bread, eggs, fresh goods for travelers." He looked at the yard. She watched him understand what she was saying, and she watched the understanding travel directly into something he wasn't willing to name yet. "That's the yard," he said. "That's what it is now," she said. "I'm talking about what it could be." "My father built that yard," he said. Each word separate, weighted. "I know," she said. "I know what it meant to him and what it means to you. And I'm sorry for that, Caleb, truly. But your father's memory isn't going to satisfy the bank in Cheyenne." The silence that followed was the kind that could break either way. "You've been here 2 days," he said. "I know how to count," she said. He put his hat back on his head. He'd been holding it, she'd noticed, the way men held hats when they were trying to stay controlled. And he walked back toward the barn without another word. Eleanor turned back to the road. He hadn't said no. Not really. He'd said what he felt, which was different, and she had learned to tell the difference between a man refusing and a man grieving. She went to the general store that afternoon. Nora Hensley was behind the counter and watched Eleanor with the concentrated interest of a woman who had already formed several opinions and was in the process of forming several more. "Mrs. Dawson," Nora said, emphasizing the name slightly, in a way that was not quite friendly and not quite unfriendly. "I need to know what seeds you carry," Eleanor said. "And what you're getting low on that the railroad workers keep asking for." Nora blinked. "Excuse me?" "Bread, eggs, vegetables. What's running short around here, and what are people traveling too far to find?" Nora looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating. "Fresh eggs," she said finally. "Everybody's low on hens. And bread, proper bread, not the hardtack those men are living on. Fresh corn when it comes up. Butter when anyone has it to spare." Eleanor nodded. "What do you charge for seed stock right now?" Nora gave her the prices. Eleanor did the arithmetic in her head, figured what the soil in that yard could realistically yield by the end of the summer, if she started now, and decided the numbers were close enough to workable that she was going to have to make them work whether they wanted to or not. She bought seeds with the money she'd brought from Missouri, a careful folded amount she'd been saving for 2 years, not for anything specific, just for the moment when she'd need it badly enough to spend it, and she carried them back to the ranch herself. She refused the offer of the boy at the store to help her carry the sacks. And she felt his surprise and Nora's watching eyes as she loaded them herself. And she thought, let them watch. She had been watched her whole life. She'd learned to move forward under the weight of it. Caleb was in the barn when she got back. She could hear him working. She carried her seeds to the kitchen, stacked them against the wall, and started supper. They ate in the same controlled quiet as the night before. She had cooked a proper meal. Chicken and roasted potatoes, biscuits that were not hard and not soft, but exactly what biscuits should be. And she watched him eat without comment, which told her he'd expected something worse, which told her plenty about what his life had looked like recently. After supper, she put the supply ledger she'd found in the kitchen drawer on the table between them. "May I?" she said. He nodded. She opened it and worked through the numbers while he refilled his coffee. The debt was worse than he'd made it sound at supper the night before. Not catastrophically worse, but meaningfully so. The kind of worse that mattered if you were trying to find a path through rather than just a place to stand. She didn't say anything about that. She just closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. "I'm going to start on the yard tomorrow," she said. I was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them was burning low. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. The sound of it in his voice was careful, like he was carrying something fragile. "That yard is—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. "My father and I laid every one of those stones ourselves, the summer before he passed. It took us all of July." She looked at him across the table. "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking you to forget it." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to trust that something growing there could be worth as much as what's buried under it." He didn't answer. He got up from the table and went to bed. Eleanor sat at the table for another hour after the lamp burned down. She sat in the dark and listened to the Wyoming night, the wind, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the particular silence of a place that was holding its breath. And she let herself feel the weight of what she was trying to do. Not the difficulty of it. She knew it was difficult. She felt the loneliness of it. The specific loneliness of a woman who had come to a strange place to build a life with a man who was not ready to want her there, and who was going to have to start anyway. She was accustomed to that feeling. She had been making herself valuable in rooms that hadn't asked for her most of her life. She was not going to stop now. Before the sun came up the next morning, Eleanor Whitmore wrapped her hands in her mother's old work gloves, walked to the front yard, and started moving stones. She moved them by hand. One at a time, then three at a time. Then she got her arms under a full load and carried them to the edge of the property and stacked them in a pile that might eventually become a border fence or a drainage channel or something else useful she hadn't thought of yet. Her back told her things she already knew. Her lungs found the rhythm they always found when her body was doing what it was built to do. She sweated, and she breathed, and she worked. And the yard changed under her hands. And the dark soil her hands already knew would be there came up into the light like something that had been waiting. Holt came out at sunrise and stood at a distance for a moment. Then he picked up the second pair of work gloves hanging on the porch post, her spare pair, which she had put there the night before without being entirely sure anyone would take them. And he walked over and started moving stones beside her. He didn't say a word. She didn't either. That was how it began. By the time Caleb came out of the house an hour later, the yard was a third cleared. He stood on the porch and looked at what she'd done with an expression she couldn't fully read from where she was working. Something between pain and a thing that hadn't become anything yet. He didn't say stop. He walked past the yard toward the barn. He came back 20 minutes later with a flat-headed shovel, and he drove it into the edge of the cleared ground and started turning the soil. Eleanor kept moving stones and did not make a single thing of it. She had learned that when a proud man turned toward you, you did not turn it into a moment. You just kept working side by side, and you let it be what it was. Young Dawes appeared mid-morning, red-faced and out of breath from running from wherever he'd been, and looked at the yard in raw astonishment. "What in the world is happening here?" he said. "Garden," Holt said, without looking up. "We're doing a garden?" "Mrs. Dawson is doing a garden," Holt said. "We're helping." Dawes looked at Eleanor. She handed him a shovel. He took it. By afternoon, The front yard was cleared. The soil was turned. The first rows were ready. Eleanor stood at the edge of what they'd made, this dark, breathing rectangle of earth. And she felt something she was careful about feeling too soon. Not hope exactly. Something more grounded than hope. The particular satisfaction of a woman who had seen a thing clearly and then made it real with her own hands. She went to the kitchen and started the bread dough. She wanted it ready to prove overnight so she could bake in the morning. She wanted to know what the bread from this kitchen smelled like, moving through the morning air toward the road, because she had a feeling about that, and she trusted her feelings when they were this specific. When she came back outside, Caleb was still in the yard. I was crouched at the far edge, his hands pressed flat to the soil, the way she'd pressed her palm to the earth that first morning. He was very still. She watched him for a moment from across the yard, this lean and guarded man pressing his hands into the ground his mother had once grown things from, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing underneath the thing. She went back inside. She would give him that moment privately. She was not in this for the credit. She was in this to save what could be saved, and she was beginning to understand that this man, this closed-up, too proud, quietly heartbroken man, was part of what needed saving. The bread went in the pans. The kitchen filled with warmth. Outside, the Wyoming night was coming down fast and cold and clean, and in the morning there would be planting to do. And beyond that, there would be more days, harder and more complicated, more fights, more moments of doubt, more silence, and more small gestures that meant more than silence. And Eleanor Whitmore, sitting at the kitchen table with flour on her hands and a ledger open in front of her and an entire future laid out in her head, like planted rows waiting for rain, thought, good. She was ready. She had always been ready. The question was whether Caleb Dawson was going to figure that out before it was too late for both of them. The bread was gone by 8 in the morning. Eleanor had set 3 loaves on the small wooden shelf she'd nailed to the gatepost the evening before. Rough cut, unfinished, barely wide enough to hold anything, with a handwritten sign propped against the post that said, fresh bread, eggs, 5 cents a loaf, 3 cents a dozen. She hadn't asked Caleb. She'd found the lumber in the barn, borrowed Holt's hammer, and done it herself in the dark before anyone else was awake. By the time the sun cleared the ridge and the first wagon rolled past, the bread was sitting there, and the smell of it was doing what the smell of fresh bread had always done since the first woman figured out that the fastest way to stop a hungry man in his tracks was to feed the air he was already breathing. The first man who stopped wasn't a railroad worker. He was a farmer's son, maybe 16, driving a cart with a broken wheel, spoke who'd slowed down to navigate the rut in the road, and looked up and saw the bread, and pulled his horse over without apparently making a deliberate decision to do so. He bought 1 loaf with coins he dug out of his coat pocket, and held the bread against his chest and said, "My ma used to make bread that smelled like this." And Eleanor said, "Tell her the recipe's nothing special. It's just patience." And the boy laughed, startled, and drove on. By noon, she had sold all 3 loaves and 11 eggs, 18 cents. She walked into the kitchen and found an empty jar in the back of the cabinet, a wide-mouthed preserving jar with a rusted lid that she cleaned out at the pump. And she put the coins in it and set it on the shelf above the stove where she'd already decided it was going to live, and she stood there for a moment looking at it. 18 cents was not a ranch. 18 cents was not a debt paid. But 18 cents was proof of a thing that nobody in Red Creek yet believed existed, and Eleanor had learned that proof was always the most important first step, because you couldn't argue with a thing you could count. She planted that afternoon. She planted on her knees in the turned soil of the yard that had been decorative gravel 48 hours ago, and she moved down each row with the focused patience of a woman who understood that every seed going in the ground was a wager on herself. Potatoes went in first. They could take the cold. They could take the neglect. They came up when everything else was still deciding whether it wanted to bother. Then beans along the southern edge, where they'd get the most sun. Then the herbs she'd started from seed herself back in Missouri, and carried wrapped in damp cloth all the way across the territory, because she had known she was coming somewhere that needed growing things, and she had prepared for it before she'd even known where she was going. Dowse sat on the fence post and watched her with the earnest bewilderment of a young man watching someone do something he had no framework for. You know how to farm? He said. I know how to keep people from going hungry, she said. That's usually the same thing. My mama farmed, he said, back in Kansas. She used to say a good garden was better than a bank account because you couldn't lose it in a drought. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at him. Your mama was right, she said. Dowes smiled the wide, uncomplicated smile of a boy who missed his mother but had not yet admitted it to himself. He climbed down from the fence post. You want me to bring more water from the pump? He said. I want you to bring water and then dig the far row out another 6 inches, she said. The soil's too compacted for carrots, and they'll twist if we don't go deep enough. I went and got the shovel without a word of argument, and Eleanor thought, this one is good. This one will do what needs doing if you give him a clear enough reason. Holt appeared at the barn door late in the afternoon and watched her plant in the way he watched most things. Not with judgment exactly, but with the careful observation of a man who had seen a great many plans come through that ranch and was reserving his enthusiasm until the evidence warranted it. Stands empty, he said. You selling more tomorrow? Double tomorrow, she said. He looked at the garden rows. You're going to need more hens, he said. I know. Weston Farm has hens, about 4 miles east. Old Harriet Weston's had more eggs than she knows what to do with since her husband took to market in Cheyenne. She might sell you some of the birds. Eleanor looked up. Would she trade, or does she need cash? Holt chewed on something invisible for a moment, the way he did when he was thinking. She'd probably trade for labor, he said. Her fence line's been needing mending for 3 months, and her son won't do it. Tell her I'll send Dawes, Eleanor said. You want me to ride out there? If you're willing. He touched his hat brim and went. Eleanor went back to planting. When she went inside to start the evening bread, Caleb was at the kitchen table with the ledger. She had left it out that morning, deliberately, with a notation in her handwriting on the inside cover that marked the day's earnings and projected what the stand might bring in over 30 days if she doubled production. She hadn't said anything about it. She'd just left it there. He was looking at her notation. I didn't say anything when she came in. She started the bread dough. She measured the flour, worked the lard in with her fingers, poured the water slow. She had been baking bread since she was 9 years old, and her hands knew the process without instructions from her brain, which left her brain free to be doing other things, which was a habit she'd developed young and had never found a reason to stop. Caleb said, This is 30-day projection. You wrote this. Yes, she said. You reckon this is accurate? I reckon it's conservative, she said. He was quiet. She worked the dough. You think you can double production with what you've got? He said. Holt's going to talk to Harriet Weston about her hens, she said. If she trades, we'll have a flock running by end of the week. I've got enough flour to bake 5 loaves tomorrow if I stretch the yeast start I've got going. Beans will be up in 6 weeks, potatoes in 10. He turned a page in the ledger, turned it back. The bank note is due in 7 months, he said. I know. This number. He tapped the projection with one finger. Even if this is right, even if you hit this every week for 7 months, it's not enough on its own, she said. I know that too. Then what? It buys time, she said. She turned the dough onto the board and started working it with her palms. Right now, the bank is watching a ranch that has no income and nothing improving. This gives them something to watch that is improving. That changes the conversation. A banker who thinks you're failing stops listening. A banker who thinks you're fighting your way back. He listens. Caleb looked at her. She kept working the dough. You've talked to bankers before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. My father lost a property when I was 12, she said. I watched my mother negotiate with every person who would sit down with her. She kept us in a house for 8 months longer than anyone thought possible. I paid attention. The silence that came after that was different from the silences they'd had before. Something had shifted slightly in the room. Some small, almost imperceptible movement in the space between two people who had been strangers last week. He put the ledger down. I'll look at the fence around the garden tomorrow, he said. Keep the cattle out while things are coming up. Eleanor shaped the loaves into their pans. I'd appreciate that, she said. That was the whole conversation. She set the pans to rise and went to wash her hands, and she thought, that is progress. Small, grudging, unlabeled progress, but real. She slept better that night than she had since she arrived. Holt came back from the Weston farm the next morning, with 6 laying hens in a crate tied to his saddle, and the information that Harriet Weston was a sharp, direct woman in her 60s who had wanted to know 3 separate things about Eleanor before agreeing to the deal. Was she from farming stock? Could she do her own labor? And did she intend to stay, or was she one of those women who came out to the territory for 3 months and then wrote letters home, crying about the wind? Holt had told her Eleanor had turned over the front yard with her own hands, and Harriet had apparently said, "All right then," and handed over the hens. Eleanor put the hens in the small enclosure beside the barn that Caleb had fixed up the evening before, without being asked, and she stood looking at them for a moment. 6 small, ridiculous birds, with their heads going in every direction, and felt something embarrassingly close to gratitude for them specifically. "6 hens won't make you rich," Dawes said from behind her. "6 hens and what they lay every day will make me someone to take seriously," she said. "That comes before rich." The stand grew, not quickly. Nothing in that territory grew quickly, but steadily, the way things grew when they were being tended by someone who understood that attention was its own kind of water. Eleanor was up before sunrise every day to bake. She baked in the quiet of the early kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the Wyoming dark pressing against the windows. And she thought while she baked, which meant that by the time the sun came up, she had usually worked through whatever problem was sitting in her mind and had arrived somewhere useful. The problem she was working through on the morning of her 12th day at the ranch was not a small one. She had been watching the wagon traffic. She had been watching it every day and marking what she could: type of wagon, apparent cargo, direction, whether they slowed down. What she'd noticed was that the heaviest traffic was going toward the railroad camp. Dozens of supply wagons, workers' wagons, equipment moving along that road every single day. And those men, she'd talked to enough of them at the stand by now to know, were eating badly. Hard biscuits, salt pork, dried beans. The camp had a cook, but the cook was feeding 200 men with a budget built for 150, and no one had adjusted for the expansion. They were hungry. They were hungry in the specific, chronic way that men got hungry when the food they were getting was enough to stay alive, but not enough to feel like a person. She thought about that for a long time while she worked the bread. The stand was bringing in money. The stand was doing what she'd said it would do. But the stand was a drip, and what the ranch needed was a river. She pulled the first loaves from the oven, set them to cool, and sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper. She was writing numbers when Caleb came in for his morning coffee. He stopped when he saw the paper. He had learned, in 12 days, that when Eleanor was writing numbers, it was usually connected to something he was about to have a strong opinion about. He poured his coffee and came to the table and looked at what she'd written. "What's this?" he said. "A contract proposal," she said, "for the railroad camp." He sat down. "What kind of contract?" "Bread, vegetables when they come up. Eggs, as many as we can produce. A daily supply delivery. I can drive it myself in the wagon if Holt can spare the horses. To the camp, every morning 6 days a week." Caleb looked at the numbers. She watched him looking at them and saw the moment when they registered. When he added them up and understood what a daily contract with 200 hungry men would mean for the ranch's finances. "They'd agree to this?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't asked." "You're planning to ride into a railroad camp and negotiate a supply contract?" "Yes." He looked at her. There was something in his face that wasn't quite the expression she'd been seeing, the careful, guarded withholding, but something different, less protected maybe, more direct. "They won't take you seriously," he said. Not cruelly, just flatly, the way he said most true things. "They will if I bring a sample," she said. She pushed a wrapped cloth toward him across the table. He opened it. 4 thick slices of bread, a hard-boiled egg, and 3 strips of the salted beef she'd been curing in the pantry since her 3rd day at the ranch. "Eat that," she said. "And tell me those men wouldn't give considerable money for a breakfast like that every morning, instead of what they're getting. He ate it. He ate it without ceremony, the way a man who was always slightly underfed ate something that was actually good, with the focused attention of a person who was not going to waste a single thing about this experience. He set the cloth down. "When are you going?" he said. "This morning," she said, "after I finish the baking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll drive you." Eleanor looked at him. "You'll have better standing if it's both of us," he said. "They'll see the ranch name. It'll look like a proper operation." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Something moved between them that neither of them was going to name. "All right," she said, and went back to her bread. The railroad camp was 3 miles east, and it hit Eleanor's senses all at once when the wagon topped the last rise. The sound first, the metallic rhythmic clang of work happening at scale. Then the smell, wood smoke and coal, and 200 men living close together. Then the sight of it, long low buildings, rows of canvas, equipment laid out in patterns that suggested order, even in the middle of what looked from the outside like organized chaos. A man named Greer managed the camp's supply operations. He was heavy-set, efficient, and deeply skeptical of Eleanor in a way that was less personal than professional. He looked at anyone proposing a supply deal with the same flat, prove-it expression that Eleanor recognized as a man who had been burned by promises before and had stopped letting optimism into the room. She put the bread on his desk before he could say anything about cost or capacity, or whether she could fulfill a contract that size. "Try it first," she said. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. He looked at Caleb, who had his hat in his hands and was letting Eleanor lead, which was something she noted with a quiet, internal acknowledgement that she'd not had time to fully process yet. Greer picked up the bread. He ate it slowly, the way a man who was used to evaluating things by their practical qualities ate something he was being asked to form a judgment about. He put it down. He looked at Eleanor. "How much?" he said. She told him. He countered. She held. He countered again, lower. She moved 3 cents per unit on the bread, held firm on the eggs, threw in the vegetables at cost for the first 2 weeks on the condition that he committed to a 90-day contract with a written renewal option. Greer looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You've done this before," he said. "I've watched people do it," she said. "I paid very close attention." He signed. On the wagon ride back, the signed paper folded in Eleanor's coat pocket, and the Wyoming late-morning sun coming down sharp and clear, Caleb did not say anything for the first mile. She didn't push it. She watched the road. Then he said, 3 cents on the bread. "I was losing him," she said. 3 cents kept him in the room, and the volume makes up the difference in the first week. He was quiet again. Then, "You know that, how? The volume math." "I did it in my head while I was holding," she said. "I had about 40 seconds between when he countered and when I responded. I ran it twice to be sure." Caleb turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the road. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes?" He seemed to be searching for what he wanted to say. His jaw worked around it for a moment. "My father would have—" He stopped, started differently. "He would have liked you," he said. "He always said the most important thing you could have on a failing piece of land was a person who could see it as something else." It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She did not make a performance of it. She received it the way she received most things that mattered, quietly, internally, with a care that showed itself later rather than immediately. "Thank you," she said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, less like walls, more like the particular quiet of 2 people who are beginning to understand that they might actually be in this together. The contract changed everything. Not immediately. The first week of daily deliveries was brutal. Eleanor was up at 4 in the morning baking. Holt was loading the wagon by 5:30, and she was driving it to the camp herself. She had refused Caleb's offer to take the deliveries because she wanted to know the men by name, wanted them to know her face, wanted the relationship to be personal, because she understood that personal relationships were harder to cancel than contractual ones. She drove in the dark with her coat pulled tight and the horse's breath coming in clouds, and she arrived at the camp to find men who were already awake and already hungry, and she learned their names. Kowalski, who was from Chicago and had 3 daughters. Bright, who was from Georgia and was saving money to bring his wife west. Old Pete, who had been laying rail since before the war and ate 3 of her biscuits in a row and said, "Lady, wherever you came from, they should have let you go sooner." She laughed at that. Real laughing, not the kind she'd been rationing. Back in Red Creek, the reaction was more complicated. The people who had watched her clear the front yard had mostly concluded she was eccentric, but ultimately harmless. The people who heard she'd driven to the railroad camp alone to negotiate a supply contract had a more divided response. The women at the church where she'd shown up her second Sunday, the same women who had given her the particular careful courtesy of people who had already decided something and were being polite about it, began looking at her differently. Not warmly, not yet, but with a recalibration she could feel. Margaret Stills, who had a farm 2 miles north and whose husband worked for Victor Langford's supply operation, stopped at the stand one Tuesday and bought a dozen eggs and then stood there a moment longer than a transaction required. "You're the one who got the camp contract," Margaret said. "That's right," Eleanor said. "Victor Langford was going for that contract," Margaret said. "Had his man in there last month. They told him the camp cook was handling supply internally." Eleanor had not known this. She kept her expression neutral. "Is that so?" "My husband says Victor isn't pleased," Margaret said. She picked up her eggs. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was complicated in a way Eleanor couldn't fully parse. Something between warning and respect, and something more personal. "You should know that." "Thank you," Eleanor said. Margaret walked away. Eleanor watched her go and filed the information in the part of her mind where she kept the things that weren't immediate problems yet, but would need attention before they became one. She told Caleb that evening. He was fixing a broke hinge on the barn door, and he stopped when she told him about Victor Langford. "You know who Langford is," he said. "I know he runs supply to most of the frontier operations in this territory," she said. "I know he has contracts with 3 of the 4 major construction crews between here and the Utah line. He's got influence with the bank in Cheyenne," Caleb said. His voice had changed. It had gone quieter and harder, the voice he used when something genuinely concerned him. "My father had a run-in with him years back. Langford wanted to buy a strip of this land that ran along the East Creek. My father refused. After that, our credit line at the bank got complicated." Eleanor looked at him. Complicated how? Harder to extend, higher rates. Every time my father went to renegotiate, there were new conditions. He picked up his tool, set it down again. "I'm not saying Langford had the bank in his pocket. I'm saying things got complicated right after my father told him no, and they never really uncomplicated again." Eleanor thought about the jar above the stove, which now had considerably more in it than 18 cents. She thought about the contract in her coat pocket. She thought about Victor Langford, whom she had never met, looking at a report about the railroad camp and finding her name attached to a contract he'd wanted. "All right," she said. "All right," Caleb said. "I needed to understand the shape of what we might be dealing with," she said. "Now I understand it better. All right." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd been seeing more frequently, the one that was not quite named but was moving in a clear direction. Most people, when they hear Victor Langford is not pleased with them, don't say "all right" like they're filing information. Most people let what they're afraid of be bigger than what they're working toward, she said. "I've never found that useful." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the hinge. But she noticed, she always noticed, that the tension had gone slightly out of his shoulders. Like something he'd been carrying for a long time had just been shared. 6 weeks after the front yard was cleared, the first beans came up. Eleanor walked the rows before sunrise, the way she walked them every morning, low to the ground, checking the soil moisture with her fingers, reading the plants with the attention her mother had taught her. And when she saw the beans, she stopped. They were small. Just the first push of green, the first declaration of a thing deciding to exist. She crouched down in the dirt and looked at them for a long time. Caleb found her there. "Beans," she said, without turning around, because she'd heard his boots on the path. "I can see that," he said. He crouched beside her. They were both close to the ground, both looking at the same small green thing, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was. And she thought it was strange, and also not strange at all, that the thing bringing them closest, so far, was a garden. "My mother planted this variety," she said. "I carried the seeds from Missouri." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You brought seeds from home." "I brought everything I thought this place might need," she said. "I didn't know exactly what that would be, but I figured it was better to bring too much than to arrive empty-handed." She felt him looking at her rather than at the beans. "Eleanor," he said. "Caleb, I owe you." He stopped, tried again. "I haven't been particularly." Another stop. She waited. She was good at waiting. "When you arrived," he said, "I was not kind. I want you to know I understand that." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the beans again, which was fine. It was easier. "You were scared," she said. "And you were proud about being scared, which made it harder." I understood. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate way to put it," she said. "I didn't come here expecting things to be easy. I came here because a man wrote me an honest letter about a hard situation, and I thought I could be useful. That's all." "That's not—" He turned and looked at her then, fully, which he didn't do very often, and which she was still getting used to. "That's not all it is. Not anymore." The morning was coming up fast around them. She could hear Holt opening the barn, Dawes calling to the horses. The world starting its machinery again. The practical, endless work of a place that was beginning to come back from wherever it had been going. She looked at him, looking at her. "No," she said. "I suppose it's not." Then she stood up, because the bread needed to go in, and the wagon needed loading, and Victor Langford was a problem. She'd need to think harder about today, and the world did not pause for small moments of honesty exchanged over bean sprouts in the early morning light, even when those moments were exactly the kind that changed everything. She went inside. She started the bread, and Caleb Dawson sat alone in the dirt of what had been his father's decorative yard, looking at a row of beans that had been carried across the country by a woman he had written the most businesslike letter of his life to, and something in his chest did what things did when they'd been frozen too long, and something warmer finally got close. He sat there for a while. Then he got up and went to work. The trouble arrived, as trouble usually did, on an ordinary morning when nothing about the day had suggested that was what it would become. Eleanor was at the stand. It was Tuesday. The camp delivery was done. She had restocked the stand with the last of the morning bread and a flat of the first real eggs from the expanded flock, when a carriage came down the road that wasn't a supply wagon and wasn't a worker's cart. It was a proper carriage, the kind that belonged to a man who had made deliberate choices about how other people should see him arriving. The man who stepped down from it was perhaps 50, dressed well without being showy, with the particular confident ease of someone who had been important for long enough that it no longer required effort. He had a pleasant face, the kind that had learned to be pleasant on purpose, and he looked at the stand and then at Eleanor with an expression of calibrated friendliness that she recognized immediately as something to be careful about. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, and he said it the same way a man said the name of a place he was thinking about buying. "I'm Victor Langford." Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at the carriage. His driver stayed up on the box, which meant this wasn't going to be a long conversation, or at least he wanted her to think it wasn't. "Mr. Langford," she said, "what can I get you?" He smiled. The smile said he appreciated the directness. Whether he actually did was a separate question. "I'm not here to shop, ma'am. I wanted to introduce myself. I have considerable interests in this territory, and I understand you're doing some interesting work out here." "We're doing what needs doing," she said. "So I hear." He looked at the stand with an expression of benign appreciation. "A farm stand. Smart thinking. The railroad workers have money and no place to spend it close by. You saw an opportunity." He paused, just barely. "Someone with experience in these markets, though. Someone who already has relationships with the camp leadership, existing supply lines, storage facilities. could take a small operation like this considerably further. Eleanor kept her hands easy at her sides. "You're talking about yourself," she said. "I'm talking about a partnership," he said. "I've helped a dozen struggling ranches and farms in this territory build real businesses. I know the buyers. I know the routes. I know the bank officials, the railroad directors, the people whose decisions make or break operations like yours." He said it warmly, reasonably, like a man doing someone a favor. "I'd be willing to come in as a partner, provide capital, supply infrastructure, market access, take a percentage of profits, and a preferred claim on future inventory contracts." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "A preferred claim," she said. "Standard in these arrangements." "And the percentage?" 40% of net operating income, he said. "In exchange for which—" "No," she said. The word was not rude. It was not loud. It was simply complete, the way a door closing was complete. Langford's pleasant expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. Something minimal. Expensive. "Mrs. Dawson, I don't think you fully—" "I understand completely," she said. 40% of net operating income and a preferred claim on future contracts means that within 2 years, you hold the most important positions in this business without having invested the work that built it. The infrastructure you're offering could be borrowed, hired, or built. The relationships you're describing, I'm building those myself. Every morning I drive that wagon to the camp. I build them." She looked at him steadily. "What you're offering is a shortcut that costs more than the long way around." Langford looked at her. The friendliness had not entirely left his face, but it had rearranged into something more honest. More interested, actually, and less warm. He was seeing her clearly for the first time, she thought, instead of seeing what he'd expected to find. "You're turning down capital you clearly need," he said. "I'm turning down terms that would trade our independence for a rescue," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." He picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it. She noticed he did the same thing Caleb did with a hat when he was managing himself, and he put it back on with a small, precise movement. "This is a hard territory, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "I hope you know what you're choosing." "I generally do," she said. He got back in the carriage. The driver moved the horses, and the carriage went back down the road, and Eleanor watched it go, and then turned back to her stand and rearranged the bread that didn't need rearranging, and let herself be still for a moment inside the decision she had just made. She heard boots on the road behind her. She turned. Caleb was walking from the barn. He had seen the carriage from across the yard, she knew. He had probably seen the whole thing. He stopped beside her. He looked down the road where Langford's carriage had gone. "Langford," he said. "Yes." What did he want? 40% of net operating income and a preferred claim on future contracts in exchange for capital and infrastructure. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "No," she said. Another moment of quiet. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name had been changing, she'd noticed, in ways that were gradual and not gradual all at once, the way seasons changed. You didn't see the exact moment it shifted, but one day you looked up and it had. "If he decides to make things difficult, the bank, the contracts, then we deal with that when it arrives," she said. "I'm not going to hand this operation to a man who wants to control it, because I'm afraid of what he might do if we don't." He stood beside her. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool morning air, and she thought about the beans, and the carriage, and 7 months on a banknote, and the jar above the stove, and 40% of something she had built with her own hands before the sun came up. "What if it's not enough?" he said, quietly. The question a man asked when he was past the point of pretending he wasn't scared. She looked at the road, the stand, the garden rows behind the fence, the ranch house with its tired paint and its missing porch board, and the life that was inside it, fragile and beginning, like bean sprouts pushing up through soil that had been buried under someone else's idea of beautiful. "Then we make more," she said. She said it simple and clear and certain, the way she said the things she was most certain about, and she felt Caleb beside her stop holding something he'd been holding, and she thought, there it is again, that small movement toward. She picked up the empty breadcloth from the stand and walked back toward the house, because the afternoon bread wasn't going to start itself, and somewhere east of here. Victor Langford was in a carriage deciding what his next move was going to be, and she needed to be 3 steps ahead of him before he made it. The work didn't stop. It never stopped. But something about it was different now. She was not doing it alone. Show more. 3 days after Victor Langford's carriage rolled back down that road, the railroad camp's purchasing manager sent a rider to the ranch. Eleanor was at the stand when the rider arrived, a young man, barely 20, with the particular nervous energy of someone delivering a message he didn't fully understand the implications of. He handed her a folded letter and waited. She opened it. Read it once. Read it again. The camp was expanding. A second crew, another 140 men, was joining the Eastern Line push by the end of the month. Greer was writing to ask whether Dawson Ranch could scale to meet the new volume. Double bread, double eggs, additional supply, or whether he needed to source a second provider. Eleanor folded the letter, handed the rider a biscuit from the stand because he looked hungry, and told him to wait. She walked to the barn. Caleb was inside working with Holt on the harness lines that had been fraying for a month. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up at her. Something moved in his face that she had learned to recognize. That specific collision between what a man had given up on and what was suddenly, confusingly, presenting itself as possible. "Can we do this?" he said. "Not alone," she said. He handed the letter back. "Then what do you need?" "I need to talk to 3 farms," she said. "The Weston place, the Briar Creek property on the North Road, and whoever's holding the Alderman land east of town. If they'll commit supply to us, we can fulfill this contract and have capacity left over." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Holt had stopped working the harness and was listening with the careful attention of a man who knew when a room had changed. "Those folks don't know you," Caleb said. "Briar Creek, Tom Hadley. He's been burned on partnership deals before. He's not going to sit down easy." "Then you come with me," she said. He looked at her. It was the same look he'd given her on the wagon ride to the railroad camp. Something working through him, something stepping aside for something else. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "After the delivery." She went back to the rider and told him to inform Mr. Greer that Dawson Ranch would send a written confirmation by the end of the week. The rider nodded, took another biscuit without being offered one, and rode back toward camp. Eleanor watched him go. She stood there in the afternoon sun, with the letter in her hand, and felt the weight of what she was about to try to do. A farm stand was one thing. One woman, one piece of land, one set of hands, and one early morning, and one wagon. What she was thinking about now was different. What she was thinking about was a network, something that connected these scattered, struggling frontier families into something with actual density and leverage, something that a man like Victor Langford couldn't absorb, because it wasn't one operation he could offer to rescue. It was many. She went inside and started writing letters. She wrote them at the kitchen table after supper, while Caleb sat across from her with the ledger, both of them working in the lamplight in the comfortable quiet that had slowly replaced the careful silence of those first weeks. She wrote to Harriet Weston first, because she already had trust there. She wrote to the Briar Creek property. She wrote to a woman named Cora Alderman, whose husband had died the previous winter, and who, according to Holt, was running the East property alone with 2 teenage sons and considerable dignity and very little margin. She did not write to ask for help. She wrote to propose a structure. Each farm would contribute what they had excess of: eggs, produce, baked goods, cured meat, whatever the land and the hands on that land could reliably produce. Dawson Ranch would aggregate, transport, and negotiate the contracts. Profits would split by contribution, calculated honestly, paid monthly. No preferred claims. No silent partners taking 40% of something they hadn't built. Every farm that joined would know what every other farm was contributing and what every contract paid. Open books. Written agreements. Her name on the documents. She finished the last letter past midnight. Caleb had gone to bed an hour earlier, but he'd refilled her coffee before he left, setting it quietly beside her elbow without interrupting her writing, and she had not looked up, but she had been aware of it in the specific way she was becoming aware of all the small ways this man moved around her. Carefully, deliberately, like he was learning the edges of something fragile and didn't want to break it. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark kitchen for a moment. Then she went to bed and slept hard and dreamed of Missouri and her mother's garden, and woke up before the alarm she didn't have because she never needed one. Tom Hadley of Briar Creek was exactly as difficult as Caleb had said he'd be. He was a broad, weathered man in his late 50s, with the deliberate slowness of someone who had made the decision a long time ago that he would not be rushed by anyone about anything. He heard Eleanor's proposal across his kitchen table with his arms crossed, and his expression fixed in the polite blankness of a man who had already decided but was allowing the conversation to run its course out of courtesy. When she finished, he said, "I've heard of cooperative arrangements. Most of them fall apart inside a year because somebody's keeping 2 sets of books." "That's why I want 1 set of books and everyone can see them," she said. "You're a woman I've known for less than a month," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "That's true," she said. "And you're asking me to stake part of my operation on your word." "I'm asking you to read a written agreement that doesn't depend on my word," she said. "I'm asking you to have your own man check the arithmetic every month. I'm asking you to pull out at 60 days' notice with no penalty if something isn't working." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hadley, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at the numbers and see if they make sense." He looked at Caleb, who was sitting beside Eleanor and had said almost nothing. "You think this works?" Hadley said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Hadley and waited. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "that I had a decorative yard full of rocks 4 weeks ago and a contract with the railroad camp for daily supply. So yes, I think it works." Hadley looked at Eleanor again. Then, moving with the same deliberate unhurry with which he did everything, he reached across the table and picked up her written proposal. He read it, the whole thing, every word. Then he put it down and said, "I've got 38 laying hens and a wife who bakes bread that would make your stand look modest. I want 40% of any contract revenue my supply generates." 35, Eleanor said, "because I'm absorbing the transport cost." 37.5, he said. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Done," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was serious and measured, the grip of a man who was committing to something and wanted you to know he understood that. Harriet Weston said yes before Eleanor finished the proposal, which told Eleanor that Holt had already talked to her, which told her something valuable about Holt that she filed away with appreciation. Cora Alderman was the conversation Eleanor had been most uncertain about. She was a thin woman who had shed everything unnecessary. She wore that thinness the way people wore things they'd come to intentionally, not as deprivation, but as a kind of precision. She had her late husband's practicality and none of his sentimentality, which was evident from the first 5 minutes of the conversation. She sat across from Eleanor and Caleb at the table of the East Property farmhouse, and she did not do the thing that most people did, which was look at Eleanor and then make a judgment, and then spend the rest of the conversation working around that judgment. She looked at Eleanor the way Eleanor liked to be looked at, directly, for information. "Your stand is bringing in real money," Cora said. It wasn't a question. "Enough to know what a coordinated supply arrangement could do," Eleanor said. "And you want my surplus grain, my stored root vegetables, whatever I can commit through fall harvest." "And your sons," Eleanor said. "If they're willing. I need drivers who know this road. I'll pay them per delivery, not per day, because I want them motivated to move fast and keep to schedule." Cora looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, but was leaning toward something Eleanor thought might be recognition. The particular recognition that moved between women who had each, in their own way, figured out how to be competent in a world that hadn't made it easy. "My older boy's 17, Cora said. "He's as reliable as anyone I know. My younger one's 15 and thinks reliability is something that happens to other people." Eleanor smiled. "The 17-year-old then. He'll want to know he's being paid the same as a grown man." "If he does the work of a grown man, he gets paid like one," Eleanor said. I don't reduce wages for age. I reduce them for performance. Cora Alderman looked at her for a long moment. My husband used to say, she said, that the best business arrangements were the ones that felt fair to everyone in the room. She stood up, extended her hand. I'm in. By Thursday of that week, Eleanor had written confirmations from 3 farms. She wrote back to Greer at the railroad camp and confirmed that Dawson Ranch, and she used that name deliberately because it was the name on the land and the name people were beginning to recognize. And she understood the value of a name that already meant something, could meet the expanded volume beginning in 3 weeks. She was at the kitchen table writing out the supply schedule when Caleb came in and sat down across from her and said, without preamble, Langford knows about Hadley and Weston. She looked up. Margaret Stills told me this morning, he said. Her husband came home saying Langford's man was asking questions about what was happening on the North Road. Who was meeting with whom? Eleanor set her pen down. He moves fast, she said. He's been in this territory for 20 years, Caleb said. He has people everywhere, not because he pays them, because he's made himself useful to enough people that they tell him things out of habit. What do you think he'll do? She said. What he always does, Caleb said. He'll wait until he sees the full shape of what you're building. Then he'll find the weakest point and push. Which is? Caleb looked at her steadily. The banknote, he said. The one we haven't paid yet. If Langford has a word in the right ear at the Cheyenne branch, can he call the note early? He can't do it himself, but if he convinces the bank that our financial situation is less stable than it appears, that the stand revenue is seasonal, that the railroad contract is short-term, that we're overextending into arrangements we can't fulfill. He stopped. They have the right to call the note at 60 days if they believe there's a material change in the borrower's risk profile. Eleanor looked at the supply schedule in front of her, at the names, Weston, Hadley, Alderman, at the numbers she had been building column by column for weeks. How much do we have in the jar? She said. He knew she knew. She asked anyway, because sometimes a thing needed to be said out loud. Enough for 1 payment against the note, he said. Maybe 1.5 if the next 3 camp deliveries come in clean. Then we need to get to the bank before Langford does, she said. He looked at her. You want to ride to Cheyenne? I want to walk into that bank with documentation of a railroad supply contract, 3 cooperative farm commitments, and 3 months of profitable trading records, she said. And I want to do it before someone with 20 years of relationships in this territory has the chance to describe us differently. Caleb was quiet. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working through something he didn't love. Cheyenne is a 2-day ride, he said. I know. We can't both go. The delivery schedule. I'll go alone, she said. Eleanor. Holt can manage the deliveries for 3 days. Cora's son can drive. I've already worked out the schedule. She had. She'd worked it out at 4 in the morning 2 days ago when she'd seen this coming. Caleb. If Langford reaches that bank first, every number I've built won't matter. They'll hear about a woman who cleared her husband's decorative yard and baked bread and called it a business. Langford will make sure that's the story. I need to be the one who tells them what this actually is. He stood up, moved to the window, stood there with his back to her, which she had learned was what he did when he was dealing with something that hit him in a place he didn't like to show. I don't like you riding to Cheyenne alone, he said. I know, she said. It's not about whether you can handle it. I know that too. It's... He turned around. His face had that stripped-down quality it sometimes got when he'd decided to stop managing himself and just say the thing. I don't like being here while you're the one taking the risk. She looked at him across the kitchen. The lamp was burning between them, and outside the Wyoming afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons did. Sharp and bright and completely indifferent. You're not being left behind, she said quietly. You're holding what I'm building while I go protect it. That's not a lesser thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she had no name for yet, but she thought she might eventually, given enough mornings in the same kitchen. Take the good wagon, he said finally, and take my rifle. I have my own rifle, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it, the almost. "Of course you do," he said. She left the following morning. It was still dark when she climbed up onto the wagon and took the reins, and Caleb was there in the yard without a coat, which told her he'd gotten up earlier than he'd meant to, and he stood beside the wagon and looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and neither of them said anything particularly useful for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on her arm, her coat sleeve, just for a second, the contact so deliberate and so contained that it said everything it was trying to say without either of them having to say it, and he stepped back. "Eleanor," he said. "I'll be back Thursday," she said. She drove out of the yard and didn't look back, because she had learned that some moments were better honored by moving forward than by looking over your shoulder at them. The road to Cheyenne was long and cold, and gave her 2 full days to think, which she used efficiently. She organized her documents inside her coat. The supply contract, signed by Greer. The cooperative agreements, signed by Hadley, Weston, and Alderman. The ledger pages she'd copied by hand, showing 3 months of stand income, delivery income, and projected forward revenue. A letter she'd written herself, setting out the business structure in plain language. What it was, how it worked, why it was sustainable. She was not going to the bank to ask for mercy. She was going to tell them what they had invested in without knowing it. She arrived in Cheyenne late afternoon and found a respectable boarding house. She paid for 1 night, no more, because she intended to be done with this in a single morning and on the road home by noon. The bank opened at 9. She was on the step at 5 minutes to 9, with her documents in a leather case Caleb's mother had left in the hall closet, which she had found and cleaned and used without asking, because she was fairly sure Caleb would have said yes, and she didn't want to take time for the conversation. The bank manager was a man named Harold Fitch, heavy-set, prosperous in the way of men who managed other people's money carefully, with wire spectacles and the expression of someone who had sat across from a great many desperate people and had learned to be sympathetic without being moved. He looked at Eleanor when she came in and did what people did. The quick read, the quick conclusion. She put the leather case on his desk before he'd finished forming his opinion. "Mr. Fitch," she said. "I'm Eleanor Dawson. I hold the note on the Dawson Ranch property in Red Creek with my husband Caleb Dawson. I'm here because I believe you should understand what that property is currently doing before anyone else has the chance to describe it to you." He looked at the case. He looked at her. Something in his professional caution sharpened into something more alert. "Sit down, Mrs. Dawson," he said. She sat. She opened the case. She laid the documents on his desk one at a time, in order, the way you laid cards when you wanted the person across from you to watch each one land. First, the railroad contract. She watched him read it. He looked up once, just briefly, and then back down. Then the cooperative agreements. 3 farms. Named, signed, dated. Then the ledger pages. Then the forward projection, which she had built conservatively because she had learned from her mother that a number you could defend was worth 10 times a number that looked impressive. Fitch read for a long time. He was a thorough man. She sat across from him and let him be thorough. He put the last page down. "This is a substantial operation for a property that was in default risk 4 months ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the point." "Who built this?" he said. Then, correcting himself, "You built this." "My husband and I," she said, and meant it, and found that she meant it more than she had expected to when she opened her mouth. Fitch took off his spectacles, cleaned them with his pocket square, put them back. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "I'll be direct with you. We received a communication last week from a party suggesting that the Dawson Ranch's recent activity was, I'll use his word, unsustainable. That the railroad contract was informal and unlikely to renew. That the cooperative arrangements were handshake deals with no binding documentation." Eleanor looked at him. "The documents in front of you," she said, "have signatures and dates. The railroad contract has 30 days' notice for cancellation and a renewal clause." Mr. Greer initialed himself. "The cooperative agreements have penalty provisions for early withdrawal. I wrote them that way on purpose." Fitch looked at the documents again. "The party who contacted us also suggested that the property's underlying cattle operation was non-viable. The cattle operation has 19 head and room to grow," she said. It's not the primary revenue source anymore. The supply network is. That's a change in business model, not evidence of failure. He was quiet. The note is due in 6 months, he said. I know exactly when it's due, she said. I'd like to discuss a payment structure that allows us to make staged payments against the principal over that period. I have the arithmetic here. She put one more piece of paper on his desk. She had done the math on the road, using the wagon bench as a desk, and her knee as a surface, and the morning light through the canvas, and she had done it until the numbers sat solid. Fitch picked up the paper. Read it. This is workable, he said slowly. I know, she said. He looked at her again. This time there was something in his expression that was not the cautious sympathy of before. It was something more straightforward than that. Something like respect, which Eleanor had stopped waiting for people to offer and had learned to simply proceed without, but which, when it came, was still something she felt. I'll need to process the documentation formally, he said. Have our solicitor review the agreements. Of course, she said. I'll wait. He blinked. It will take several hours. I know, she said. I'll wait. She waited in the lobby of the bank for 4.5 hours. She sat in the chair nearest the window and worked through the next month's supply schedule in her head, and watched the street and ate the biscuit she'd brought in her coat pocket, and thought about Caleb in the kitchen that morning she'd left, standing without his coat in the cold yard, his hand on her sleeve. At 2 in the afternoon, Fitch came out with a junior clerk and 2 documents. One was a formal acknowledgement of the payment structure she'd proposed, with the bank's signature. The other was a written note, not official, handwritten on the bank's letterhead, that said, "The Dawson Ranch account is in good standing and subject to no adverse action at this time." In case the question comes up, Fitch said, from any direction. She looked at the note. She understood what he was telling her. He had seen Victor Langford's communication. He had seen hers. He had made a decision about which picture of the Dawson Ranch was accurate, and he was handing her something she could use if she needed to. "Thank you, Mr. Fitch," she said. "Thank your arithmetic, Mrs. Dawson," he said. She was on the road home before 3. She drove hard and made the first 20 miles before dark and camped where the road bent north, wrapped in the blanket Caleb had put in the wagon bed without telling her, which she had found when she stopped the first night, and which she had spread around herself with a feeling she was not going to analyze too carefully right now. She got back to Red Creek on Thursday afternoon. Caleb was in the yard when the wagon came up the road. She could see him from a distance, standing at the fence gate. He had been watching for the wagon, she realized, which told her things she already knew and didn't need spelled out. He stepped forward when she pulled the horses up. She climbed down. She handed him Fitch's handwritten note first. He read it, looked up. "He gave you this?" "He understood what I was showing him," she said. "And I think he understood who had tried to describe it differently." Caleb folded the note with the careful deliberateness of someone folding something valuable. He put it inside his coat. Then he looked at her, properly, fully, the way he had been learning to look at her. And she looked back at him, and they stood there in the late afternoon light of a Wyoming autumn, and the ranch was behind him, and the road was behind her, and between them was everything they had been building without calling it what it was. "You should have let me come with you," he said. "Next time," she said. "There'll be a next time?" "Caleb," she said, "we're just getting started." Something in his face opened. Not all the way. He was not a man who did things all the way, all at once. She had accepted that. But enough. Enough that she saw it, and he let her see it, and that was its own kind of thing. "Come inside," he said. "Holt made something that might be edible." She almost laughed. "That's the most frightening thing you've said to me since I arrived." She walked past him toward the house, and he fell in beside her, and his shoulder was close to hers in the way that close was becoming, and neither of them said anything about it. What they didn't know, what was waiting for them on the other side of that ordinary Thursday evening, was that Victor Langford was not a man who absorbed a no and a bank rebuke and went home. He was a man who waited. He was a man who watched. And he had spent 20 years in this territory, learning that the thing most likely to destroy a small operation was not the competition from without, but the fractures from within, Moment when partners stopped trusting each other, when the pressure of trying became the pressure of too much. Hai had something in mind, and the particular shape of what he had in mind had nothing to do with the bank, or the railroad contract, or the cooperative agreements. It had to do with a woman's reputation, and it was already in motion. Margaret Stills came to the stand on Friday morning with an expression Eleanor recognized from a long distance. The expression of a woman who was carrying information she didn't want to carry, who had argued with herself about whether to come, and who had come anyway. Eleanor set down the bread she was wrapping and waited. "There's talk," Margaret said. "In town." "What kind of talk?" Eleanor said. Margaret looked uncomfortable in the specific way people looked when they were about to repeat something they found distasteful. "About you and the railroad camp," she said. "About why the workers buy from you every morning. About why you go there yourself instead of sending the hands." Eleanor was very still. "Langford's doing," Margaret said. "At least, that's where it started. His man was in the saloon 2 nights ago. I wasn't there, but my husband was, and he told me—" She stopped. "Eleanor, I want you to know I don't believe any of it. And I don't think most sensible people believe it either. But it's being said." Eleanor looked at the road, at the stand, at the carefully lettered sign that said, "Dawson Ranch Fresh Goods." She felt something cold move through her that was not fear. She was past the point where this kind of thing produced fear, but was something adjacent to it. The specific fury of a woman who had worked before dawn every day for months and had just been told that someone was in a saloon at night, undoing it with words that cost him nothing. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Her voice was completely level. Margaret put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked at the stand, at the garden rows behind it, at the ranch house where Caleb was, where the jar above the stove was, where the ledger sat on the kitchen table with 3 months of honest arithmetic. "What I always do," she said. "Work." Margaret left. Eleanor stood there for 60 seconds. She counted them, and let herself feel it. All of it. The anger and the exhaustion and the specific injustice of it. The way a man like Langford could sit comfortable and clean and use words to try to destroy what she'd built with her body and her mind and her before-dawn hours. 60 seconds. Then she wrapped the bread, set it on the stand, waited for the first wagon, because there was bread to sell and a ranch to save, and a story being told about her in a saloon by a man who had never gotten up at 4 in the morning in his life. And she intended to make sure the story told by her numbers, her contracts, and the people who had bought from her every single morning was louder. She was going to need Caleb. She was going to need all of them. And she was going to need to move before Langford's words traveled further than his carriage. She called it in her mind, the plan that had been forming since Margaret said the words about you and the railroad camp. And she looked at it clearly and directly the way she looked at all the things that were difficult, and she thought, "All right, if he wants to play it this way." She picked up the last wrapped loaf. The first wagon of the morning was coming down the road. She smiled at the driver, said good morning, made the sale, and inside the part of her that planned and calculated and refused to stop, the part that had carried seeds from Missouri and turned gravel into soil and walked into a bank in Cheyenne alone. The next move was already made. "Show more. Show more," she told Caleb that night. She did not soften it. She did not approach it sideways or wrap it in reassurance before getting to the point. She set the supper dishes between them, and she said, "Langford is spreading talk about me and the railroad camp, the kind of talk designed to make people question why I go there myself." Caleb went very still. She watched it move through him, the information traveling from his ears to his understanding to somewhere deeper, somewhere that produced a reaction she had not seen on his face before. It was not the controlled withholding she'd learned to read. It was something rawer than that, something that had no careful management around it. "Who told you?" he said. "Margaret Stills." "When?" "This morning." His jaw tightened. "You've been sitting on this all day." "I needed to think before I talked," she said. "I don't say things until I know what I mean to do about them." He stood up from the table, moved to the window, stood there with his back to her the way he did when something had gotten past his defenses, and he needed a moment. Then he turned around, and the look on his face was direct in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not careful. Not managed. Just direct. "Eleanor," he said, "I'm going to ride into town tomorrow, and I'm going to find Langford's man, and I'm going to make very clear." "No," she said. "Eleanor." "Caleb, listen to me." Her voice was firm and quiet. "If you ride into town and make a scene, the story stops being about what Langford said and starts being about what you did. That's exactly what he wants. He wants this to be loud and personal and ugly. Because loud and personal and ugly destroys reputations, and our reputation right now is the only thing protecting that railroad contract and those cooperative agreements." He looked at her. She could see it cost him, staying still when everything in him wanted to move. "Then what?" he said. "We make it impossible for the talk to stick," she said. "We do it publicly, formally, and before he gets further." She pulled the piece of paper she'd been writing on all afternoon across the table. "I want to hold an open gathering here at the ranch. Invite every family in the cooperative, the neighboring farms, the church women, the town council if they'll come. I want to open our books on the table, every number, every contract, every agreement. And I want the community to see exactly what we've built and who built it." He looked at the paper, back at her. "You want to put everything in front of everyone. The only way to kill a story built in the dark," she said, "is to take it into the light." He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp was burning low between them. Outside, the wind had picked up the way it did in the fall. Serious, insistent, the kind of wind that reminded you it intended to stay. "You thought of all this today," he said, "while you were running the stand." "I think well when my hands are busy," she said. He looked at her with an expression she had stopped trying to name and had simply started accepting. This particular quality of attention he gave her, that was not what either of them had expected when he wrote that practical, loveless letter to a placement agency in St. Louis. "All right," he said. "When?" "Saturday," she said. 4 days. Enough time to get word to everyone who matters." He sat back down at the table. "I'll ride to Hadley's tomorrow morning," he said. "And Weston. You write to Cora Alderman. Holt knows half the town. He can carry the word to the farmers on the South Road." "And the church," she said. "Reverend Marsh. If he comes, the women will come." "Marsh is careful about taking sides." "I'm not asking him to take sides," she said. "I'm asking him to witness something honest. That's not politics. That's his job." Caleb almost smiled. There it was. The almost. The thing she'd started quietly watching for the way you watched for the first light before dawn. "I'll talk to him," he said. They worked through the details for another hour, passing the paper back and forth across the table, writing names and logistics and what needed to happen each day between now and Saturday. At some point, Eleanor refilled both their coffee cups without stopping the conversation, and at some point, Caleb took over the list and his handwriting joined hers on the page, and she noticed that, their handwriting side by side on the same piece of paper, planning the same thing. And she thought, this is what it was supposed to be. Not what it was at the beginning. This. She went to bed late. She lay in the dark and thought about Saturday and what it required and whether she had the strength for the specific vulnerability of it, standing in front of the people who had whispered about her since the day she stepped off that wagon, opening every number and every decision to scrutiny, being seen completely. She decided she did. She had been seen incompletely her whole life, and she was tired of it. Being seen completely, even if some people didn't like what they found, was better than the half-life of other people's assumptions. She was up at 4. The bread went in the oven. The morning came. Caleb left before sunrise for Hadley's farm. He took the good horse and he rode hard, and he was back by mid-morning with Hadley's word that he'd be there Saturday and would bring his wife, who made the best dried apple cake in the county and considered community gatherings a civic responsibility. Eleanor filed this information about the cake separately because it was the kind of detail that mattered. Holt took the South Road and came back with 4 confirmed families by afternoon. He reported these with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for something useful to do and had found it. Dawes, who had been given the assignment of getting word to the younger families along the creek road, came back muddy from a creek crossing he had misjudged but otherwise successful, having stopped at 6 properties and received what he described as general enthusiasm and 2 offers of pie. "Good," Eleanor said. "Tell them to bring the pie." Dawes stared at her. "Really?" "People who bring something feel like they're part of what happens," she said. "That's the point." He went back out to deliver the pie amendment. Cora Alderman arrived in person on Thursday morning. She had not written back. She had simply come, which Eleanor was learning was how Cora did most things. She tied her horse at the fence gate and walked to the stand where Eleanor was serving the morning customers, and she stood and waited until there was a gap, and then she said, without greeting, "I heard about what Langford's man said." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I want you to know," Cora said, "that my older boy Joshua told every man at the camp delivery yesterday that whoever was spreading talk about Mrs. Dawson had clearly never gotten up before dawn and done honest work in their life, and that he personally vouched for every minute of every morning he had worked alongside her operation." She paused. "I did not instruct him to do this. He did it on his own." Eleanor looked at her. Something moved in her chest that she had to hold very carefully. "How old is he?" she said. 17, Cora said. "He's a good man," Eleanor said. "He's going to be," Cora said. "He's not quite there yet, but he's going to be." She looked at the stand, at the garden rows, at the ranch house behind them. "What do you need me to bring Saturday?" "Whatever you have that can feed a crowd," Eleanor said. "I'll bring both boys and a barrel of hard cider," Cora said, and went back to her horse and rode away. Friday arrived with a problem. The storm came up fast, the way Wyoming storms came, with very little warning and complete commitment. By mid-morning, the sky had gone the color of iron, and the wind that had been serious all week became something else entirely. By noon, the first hail was hitting the stand roof that Eleanor had reinforced with a second layer of lumber after the first windstorm had taken a corner off, and by 2 in the afternoon, Holt was bringing the hens in from the yard because the sky looked like it intended to mean business. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the garden. The beans were full. The potatoes were nearly ready for first harvest. The herbs had spread across their row like they'd been there for years. She had worked every inch of that garden with her own hands, every morning, the way she'd worked everything, before the world asked for it, before anyone else was ready to believe it mattered. The hail got harder. "Eleanor." Caleb was behind her. "Come inside." "The beans." "Come inside," he said again, and his hand was on her shoulder, warm, certain, deliberate, and she stepped back from the doorway. The storm hit full for 2 hours. They sat in the kitchen and listened to it work. Caleb fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door that had been bothering him for weeks. Eleanor mended the harness strap that had been fraying on the delivery wagon. Holt played cards with Dawes at the far end of the table and lost 3 hands in a row with the dignity of a man who had made his peace with Dawes's unexpected competence at cards. When the storm passed, they went outside together. The garden had taken damage, not devastation. Eleanor had seen fields after hail, and she knew the difference between setback and disaster, but real damage. The bean row along the north edge had lost its upper growth. The herbs were flattened. 3 of the potato rows were badly bruised. She walked the rows without speaking. Caleb walked beside her. He didn't say anything reassuring, which she appreciated, because empty reassurance was something she had no patience for. He just walked beside her and looked at what was there and what wasn't. "We can replant the herbs," she said finally. "It's late, but there's enough season left." "Beans?" he said. "The root stock is intact. They'll come back, slower." She crouched at the north row and pressed her fingers into the soil. "The potato yield will be down by 1/3, maybe more." Caleb crouched beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "The camp contract." "The camp contract is bread and eggs," she said. "The garden is supplemental income. We don't lose the contract." She stood up. "We lose margin on this month's produce sales. That's real, but it's not catastrophic." "The gathering's tomorrow," he said. "Yes." If people come and they see the storm damage, good, she said. He looked at her. I want them to see it, she said. I don't want to show people a perfect operation. I want to show them a real one. A perfect operation is something you look at and admire. A real one is something you want to be part of. She looked at the damaged rows, at the flattened herbs, at the potato mounds the hail had roughed up. We clean what we can, we leave the rest honest, and we show them what we're building anyway. He stood beside her in the wet after-storm air, and she felt him understand it, the specific intelligence of what she'd said. And then she felt something else, something she'd been feeling more of recently, which was Caleb Dawson deciding, in whatever internal way men like him made decisions, something she didn't yet have words for. He said, My father used to say that what a piece of land looked like after a storm told you more about it than what it looked like in good weather. Smart man, she said. He was, Caleb said. He would have said the same about people. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. After a moment, he looked at her. Eleanor, he said. She waited. He'd been getting closer to something for weeks now, circling it the way careful men circled things they'd been burned before and hadn't recovered easy. I wrote that letter to the agency, he said, because I needed help and I'd run out of other ideas. I want you to know I understand how insufficient that was, as a beginning. You were honest, she said. I'd rather have honest than romantic. That's not... He stopped. What I'm trying to say is that what we have now, what this is... Another stop. His jaw worked. She waited. I don't want you to think I can't see it. What you've done here. What you are. I see it, Eleanor. I see it clearly. She held his gaze. The late afternoon light was coming through the storm clouds in the particular broken way it came when weather was clearing. Golden and sideways and a little fierce. I know you do, she said quietly. I've been watching you see it for a while. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not the way things happened in stories. He just reached out and took her hand, the way a man took hold of something he intended to keep, and she let him, and they stood in the damaged garden in the clearing light, and neither of them said anything, because neither of them needed to. Then she squeezed his hand once and said, We have a gathering to prepare for. And he said, Yes, ma'am. And she looked at him sharply, because he'd never said that before, and the corner of his mouth was doing something she was fairly certain was the closest thing to a full smile she was going to see today, and she thought, there it finally is. They worked until dark. Holt and Dawes moved tables out of the barn and set them in the yard. Eleanor baked 4 batches of bread and a quantity of biscuits that she would not fully account for until morning. Cora Alderman arrived with her boys and the barrel she'd promised and helped Eleanor lay out the table arrangements with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had organized things under worse conditions. Joshua Alderman, who was 17 and already had the steady quality of a man twice that, quietly rebuilt the section of stand roof the storm had knocked loose. Nobody asked him to. He just did it. Saturday morning came clear and cold and bright. The way Wyoming mornings came after a storm had cleaned everything. Like the sky had decided to start over and was committed to it. They came. They came from the North Road and the South Road and the creek farms and town. They came in wagons and on horseback, and 2 families came on foot because the road to their place was too muddy for a wagon, but they had said they would come, and they came. Harriet Weston arrived early and took her place beside the bread table like a woman who had been running community gatherings since before half these people were born. Tom Hadley arrived with his wife and the dried apple cake and stood to one side, watching with the particular wariness of a man who was impressed and didn't want to admit it too early. Reverend Marsh came. He shook Caleb's hand and then Eleanor's and said, I've been hearing a great deal about this place. And Eleanor said, I hope some of it was about the bread. And he laughed, which she took as a good sign. And then, an hour into the gathering, when the yard was full and the food was moving and people were talking with the loose ease of neighbors who had been given a reason to be in the same place, Victor Langford arrived. He came alone. No carriage this time. Just a horse and a riding coat, and that same pleasant expression he wore like a professional tool. He dismounted at the fence gate and looked over the yard with the careful assessment of a man recalculating. Eleanor saw him before Caleb did. She set down the bread she was cutting, and she walked to the gate, and she stopped in front of him. The yard went quiet, the way crowds went quiet when they sensed the temperature of a room changing. "Mr. Langford," she said. "Mrs. Dawson." He looked around the gathering. Something moved in his expression. Something that was not the calculation she was used to seeing, but something closer to a man genuinely reevaluating. "This is quite an assembly. We believe in doing things together out here," she said. "You're welcome to stay if you're interested in that kind of thing." He looked at her. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she brought to everything. Not aggressive, not warm, just completely settled. "I've heard," he said quietly, "that you went to Cheyenne." "I did." "And that the bank is satisfied with our account status," she said. "Yes." She paused. "Did you need something specific, Mr. Langford, or did you come to see what we've built?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the tables, the families, the children, the farmers she'd organized into something cohesive, the bread and the biscuits, and Cora Alderman's hard cider, and Tom Hadley's wife's apple cake, and Holt standing at the far end of the yard with the ease of a man at home. "I came," he said, and for the first time, she heard something in his voice that was different from all the other times. Something stripped of the professional pleasantness, something more honest. "To see if what I'd been told about you was accurate." "And?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "It wasn't," he said. "What I was told was considerably smaller than what's actually here. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get from him, and she knew it." "You're welcome to a plate," she said. "Harriet Weston's deviled eggs are worth the ride from wherever you came from." He almost smiled. "Another time," he said. He put his hat back on. He looked at the yard one more time. The full weight of it. The thing she'd built from 18 cents and a jar on a shelf and seeds she'd carried from Missouri. Then he looked at Eleanor. "You're going to be difficult to work around," he said. "I'm not trying to work around you," she said. "I'm trying to build something beside you. There's room in this territory for both." He held her gaze. Something settled in his expression. Not defeat, exactly. More like a man who had been in enough negotiations to recognize when a position had shifted permanently. "Good day, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "Good day, Mr. Langford," she said. He rode back down the road. The yard watched him go. Then conversation resumed. The way sound returned after something had passed, and Eleanor turned back to her gathering and found Caleb standing 3 feet behind her. He had heard everything. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You offered him deviled eggs," Caleb said. "Harriet's are very good," she said. He shook his head slowly. But the thing happening on his face now was the full version of what she'd been seeing the almost of for months. A full, real, unmanaged smile. Not the almost. The thing itself. She walked back to the bread table. Caleb stood there for another moment, looking at the road where Langford had gone, and then looking at his yard. The garden rows, the stand, the gathered community of people who had come, because Eleanor Whitmore from Missouri had turned gravel into soil, and turned soil into something people wanted to be part of. And something in his chest did what it had been doing in small increments for months. It finished the job. He walked back into the gathering and stood beside his wife at the bread table, and Holt caught his eye from across the yard and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, and Caleb nodded back. By the time the last family left that afternoon, and the tables were being folded back into the barn, and Dawes was finishing off the last of the biscuits with the devotion of a man who understood a limited resource, Eleanor sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The jar above the stove had 6 months of savings in it now. The bank was satisfied. The cooperative had held. The railroad contract was secure. Langford had come and looked and left without a weapon worth using. And the talk. The talk from the saloon. The whisper Langford had designed to chip away at everything she'd built. It had hit the wall of a yard full of people who had eaten her bread and signed her agreements and watched her drive to the railroad camp every morning and come home with honest money. And the talk had simply failed to stick. Caleb came and sat beside her on the steps, not at a distance. Beside her, the way they'd been doing things for a while now, close, present, without ceremony. "Joshua Alderman fixed the stand roof last night," he said. "I know," she said. "Nobody asked him." "I know that too." He was quiet. Then, "You build loyalty the way you build gardens. Like you know exactly what kind of soil a person needs, and you just put them in it." She looked at him. "That might be the most poetic thing you've said since I arrived." "Don't get used to it," he said. "Oh," she said. "I think I already have." He reached over and took her hand again, the same way he had in the garden. Unceremonious, certain, like a man who had made a decision quietly and completely and wasn't going to announce it, but wasn't going to hide it either. She held his hand and looked out at what had been a decorative yard of gravel and stones laid with grief and pride by a man and his dying father on a July afternoon in a year that already felt like a different world. What was there now? Now was something else. Something that had come from the ground up because she had looked at what everyone else called beautiful and asked what it could feed instead. "Caleb," she said. "The note," she said. "The bank note. We need to talk seriously about the spring payment. Because what happened today, the cooperative, the turnout, all of it. I think we can go back to Fitch with a proposal to restructure the whole remaining principal across 18 months instead of paying it down in chunks. It would give us breathing room to expand the flock and add—" He started laughing. She stopped, looked at him. He was laughing, real laughing, the full version, leaning slightly forward with the specific helpless quality of a man who had been caught completely off guard by his own amusement. "What?" she said. "Eleanor," he said, still half laughing. "I just held your hand on our porch after everything today, and you started talking about the banknote." "The banknote is important," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I know." He shook his head. The laughter settled into the realest smile she'd seen from him, warm and unguarded and entirely without its usual defenses. "Tell me about the 18-month restructure," she told him. He listened. They sat on the steps of the porch of the ranch that was no longer dying as the Wyoming dusk came down clean and cold around them. Inside the house, the jar above the stove was full, and somewhere east of them, in the railroad camp where Kowalski and Bright and Old Pete were finishing their day's work, a story was being told around a supper table about the woman from the ranch on the West Road who drove the bread wagon herself every morning, who knew every man's name, who had built something real from something everyone had written off. And the story was spreading the way true things spread, without needing to be pushed. Tomorrow the bread would go in the oven at 4. The wagon would load at 5:30. The road would take them east. And every day after that would be another day of building. She was not done. She was, in the way of people who built things worth building, just beginning to understand the full size of what she was making. The spring would bring more decisions, more pressure, more moments where the right thing and the easy thing would point in completely opposite directions, and she would have to choose. But she would choose with Caleb beside her now. And that, she was learning, changed the arithmetic of everything. The 18-month restructure went through. Fitch signed the paperwork in February, 6 weeks after Eleanor had laid out the proposal on Caleb's porch in the dark with a cup of cold coffee in her hand. She received the confirmation by post on a Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen table in her coat because she'd come in from the morning delivery and hadn't taken it off yet. She read the letter twice, set it on the table, went and poured herself a proper cup of coffee, sat down. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was longer than the 60 seconds she'd given herself on the day Langford's carriage went back down the road. This one deserved more. This was the thing that had been pressing against everything else for months. The number that sat behind every other number. The clock that had been running underneath every morning delivery and every planted row and every jar of coins above the stove. She let herself feel the relief of it going quiet. Then she went back to work. Spring came to Wyoming territory. The way it always came. Reluctantly, with reversals, 2 steps forward and 1 back. A warm week followed by a hard frost that would have killed the early bean starts if Eleanor hadn't covered them the night before with the burlap she'd kept ready specifically because she had learned not to trust a Wyoming spring any further than she could throw it. She was up at midnight to check the temperature, which was something Caleb had started waking up for too, not because she asked him to, but because at some point in the winter he had simply started being present for the things she was present for, and neither of them had made a declaration about it. They had not made declarations about much. They had made a life instead, which Eleanor was coming to believe was the more reliable of the two options. The cooperative had grown through the winter. Word traveled in the way word traveled in frontier communities, slowly and then all at once, the way water found its way through rock. A farm 12 miles east of Briar Creek had sent a letter asking to join in December. 2 more families in January. By March, Eleanor was coordinating supply from 9 separate properties, running 3 delivery routes, and had hired Cora Alderman's younger son, the unreliable 15-year-old, who had apparently decided that reliability was something that could happen to him after all, as a second driver. His name was Daniel. He was 16 by then. He was not as steady as Joshua, but he was fast, and he learned routes the way some people learned music. By feel, quickly, with an instinct for when to push and when to ease back. Eleanor paid him the same as she'd promised Cora she'd pay Joshua, full rate for full work, regardless of age. He came to her after his 3rd week and said, "Mrs. Dawson, I told my ma I'd save enough for a horse of my own by summer. Am I on track?" Eleanor did the arithmetic in her head. If you don't miss a delivery, and you take the Saturday overflow route when Kowalski's crew moves to the east section, yes, she said. Easily. He stood up straighter. She could see it happen. The specific physical change that came over a young person when they understood that their goal was reachable. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Daniel," she said. "Ma'am?" "Don't call me ma'am," she said. "It makes me feel old." He grinned. "Yes, Mrs. Dawson," he said, which she decided was close enough. Caleb watched all of this from the particular vantage point of a man who had spent years managing a failing operation alone and was now watching something grow in a way he hadn't known how to want for. He did not stay out of it. That was the thing she noticed most about the way Caleb had changed. He had stopped standing at the edges of things and had started being inside them. He negotiated a new hay supply agreement in January that freed up 3 months of the cattle feed budget. He rebuilt the barn roof in February himself, with Holt and Dawes and Joshua Alderman, working in the February cold without complaint. And when Eleanor brought them hot coffee mid-morning, she found the 4 of them working with the comfortable efficiency of men who had been doing things together long enough to stop needing to explain themselves. He had also, quietly, over the course of the winter, begun to expand the cattle operation. He had said nothing about it directly. He'd mentioned in passing, in the way he mentioned things he was still deciding whether he was committed to, that the feed situation made it feasible to bring the herd up if the spring market held. Eleanor had said, "How many?" He'd said, 8 to start. She'd said, "Make it 12 and use the east pasture you've been underusing." He'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "I was going to say that next." She'd said, "I know." He'd bought 12. The herd, which had been 19 head when Eleanor arrived with her 3 folded questions and her coat bag and her mother's seeds, was 34 by April. Not what it had been at its peak under his father, but moving in the right direction and moving with purpose rather than drift. Tom Hadley came by in April with his wife and the specific expression of a man who wanted to say something and was taking the long way around to it. They sat at the kitchen table, and Hadley's wife, whose name was Ruth, and who had the dry, affectionate practicality of a woman who had managed Tom Hadley for 30 years and considered it a reasonable life's work, accepted Eleanor's coffee and looked around the kitchen with the eyes of someone making a genuine assessment. "Place looks different than I expected," Ruth said. "Different how?" Eleanor said. "Lived in," Ruth said. "Good kind of lived in." Hadley cleared his throat. He unfolded a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a letter. Eleanor could see it was a letter from the railroad company's regional director, based on the letterhead. She did not reach for it. She waited. "They're extending the line another 40 miles east," Hadley said. New camp, new crew, bigger than the last one. He pushed the letter across the table. They want a supply arrangement for the whole operation, not just bread and eggs, everything. Meat, grain, preserved goods, the full provision. The letter's addressed to Dawson Ranch. He paused. But the operation they're describing, Eleanor, is bigger than Dawson Ranch can handle on its own. Eleanor looked at the letter. She read it without picking it up, bending slightly over the table, moving through each line with the quick, absorbing attention she brought to numbers. "How many men?" she said. 300 at peak, Hadley said. She looked up. "We need every farm in the cooperative and at least 2 more properties. We need a second wagon. We need dedicated cold storage, which we don't currently have." "That's what I figured," Hadley said. "Question is whether we try for it." Eleanor looked at Caleb. He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching her the way he watched her when she was working through something large, with that particular quality of attention that was not interference, just presence, full, steady presence. "Yes," she said. Hadley looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She said yes, Caleb said to Hadley. Ruth Hadley made a sound that was very close to a laugh. She picked up her coffee. "All right then," Hadley said. The next 6 weeks were the most complex thing Eleanor had ever built. She organized it the way she organized everything, by starting at the end and working backward. 300 men needed provisioned, every day, 6 days a week, with Sunday reduced. She mapped the supply requirements against what the cooperative's 9 farms could currently produce, identified the gaps, and started filling them. She rode to 2 new farms in the first week. The first was a property run by a German family named Schreiber, who had been in the territory for 8 years and had more stored grain than they could sell in the current market, and a patriarch who drove a harder bargain than anyone she'd dealt with, except possibly Fitch, at the Cheyenne Bank. She spent 3 hours at their kitchen table. She left with a grain supply agreement and the distinct impression that Herman Schreiber had enjoyed himself. The second was a property she almost didn't visit, a small homestead south of Briar Creek, run by a woman she'd heard mentioned in passing, a widow named Patience Ewan, whose husband had come west with the railroad and stayed when the line moved on, buying the small piece of land and starting a kitchen garden that had grown, in the years since his death, into something considerably larger than a kitchen garden, but smaller than a proper farm. Patience grew vegetables with the precision of someone for whom growing things was not occupation, but expression, and the variety of what she grew was unlike anything else Eleanor had encountered in the territory. Eleanor rode there alone on a Thursday, and found a small woman in her 50s on her knees in a garden that made Eleanor's own garden look like a rough draft. Patience. Ewan looked up when Eleanor dismounted. She looked at Eleanor with the calm directness of someone who did not have time for performance. "You're the woman from Dawson Ranch," she said. "Eleanor Dawson," Eleanor said. "Yes, I've heard about you," Patience said. She sat back on her heels. "They say you turned your husband's decorative yard into a farm stand." "His mother's garden, technically," Eleanor said. "I just cleared what was covering it." Patience looked at her for a moment. Then she stood up, stripped her gloves, and said, "Come inside, I'll make tea." Eleanor came inside. They drank tea at a table surrounded by drying herbs and seed packets labeled in 2 languages and shelves of preserved goods that were as close to a work of art as preserved goods could reasonably be. Eleanor laid out the proposal. Patience listened with her hands around her cup and her eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance, the way people listened when they were doing real thinking rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. When Eleanor finished, Patience said, "The men at the camp, they eat what you bring them every morning." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Are they well fed?" Eleanor thought about Kowalski's 3 daughters and Bright's wife he was saving to bring west, and old Pete eating 3 biscuits before anyone else was awake. "Better than they were," she said. "Not yet as well as they should be." Patience nodded slowly. "My husband worked a railroad camp," she said. "He used to write to me about the food." A pause. "He said eating badly made the work feel worse than it was." "He was right," Eleanor said. "I'll join," Patience said. "But I want control of my own supply decisions. I'll commit to a base volume each week, and anything above that, I'll price separately." "Agreed," Eleanor said. "And I want a seat at your cooperative meetings." "Every farm gets a seat," Eleanor said. "That's always been the structure." Patience looked at her. "Your husband approves of this? A woman running the arrangements?" "My husband," Eleanor said, "replaced the fence around the garden the morning after I told him I was going to plant one, without being asked. And he bought 12 cattle instead of 8 because I told him to use the east pasture." She picked up her cup. "He approves." Patience almost smiled. "Good man," she said. "Getting better every day," Eleanor said. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with Patience Ewan's signed agreement in her coat and a bundle of dried herbs that Patience had pressed into her hands without explanation, and she thought about the shape of what she'd built. 9 farms, now 11. A cooperative structure with open books and written agreements, and every person holding their own piece of it. No single point of control. No preferred claims. No silent partners taking 40% of something they hadn't built. She thought about Victor Langford. She hadn't seen him since the gathering. He was still in the territory. He would always be in the territory. A man like that didn't leave. He simply adjusted and waited for the next opportunity. But he had not come back to the ranch. Had not sent his man with whispers to the saloon. Had not, as far as she could tell, made any further move against them. She thought she understood why. The thing he'd tried to undermine, her reputation, her credibility, her standing with the community, had been answered not by a defense, but by an accumulation. Every morning delivery, every open book cooperative meeting, every honest payment made on time to every farm in the network. These things were not arguments. They were evidence. And evidence, over time, displaced narrative. You could tell a story about a woman. You could not tell a story about numbers that spoke for themselves. She got home after dark. Caleb was in the kitchen with Holt, both of them at the table, which was covered in paper. Supply route maps that Caleb had been drawing up for the expanded operation. He had been working on them, she realized, for days. He looked up when she came in. "Patience Yuen?" he said. "She's in," Eleanor said. He nodded, pointed at the map. "I've been thinking about the cold storage problem. There's a limestone formation on the north edge of the east pasture. My father used it for ice storage 2 winters running before the equipment wore out. If we rebuild it, we could hold 3 weeks of preserved goods at temperature." Eleanor took off her coat, sat down at the table, looked at the map. "How long to rebuild?" 2 weeks if I've got 4 men. Joshua, Alderman, and Daniel, Holt and Dawes," she said. "That's 4. "I was going to say that next," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression. The full version, not the almost, the real one that had been coming more easily since the gathering, since the porch, since all the incremental moments of a winter spent building something in the same direction. "I know," she said. Holt picked up his coffee and very deliberately looked at the wall. Eleanor spread her hand on the map beside Caleb's hand, and they looked at the routes together and worked until midnight, the lamp burning low between them. And it was the same as it had been every night that mattered. The 2 of them at the same table with the same problem and the same direction, and no distance left between them that wasn't comfortable. The expanded contract went through in May. The day it was signed, Eleanor drove the morning delivery herself, the same as every other morning, and she pulled the wagon into the railroad camp, and Kowalski came running from his tent because he'd heard, and he was a man who ran toward good news without embarrassment. And he grabbed her hand and shook it hard and said, "Mrs. Dawson, when my girls are grown, I'm going to tell them about you." And Eleanor said, "Tell them to drive their own wagons." And he laughed so hard, the men around him turned to look. Old Pete shuffled up and took his 3 biscuits and said, "Heard you're feeding the new camp, too." "That's right," she said. "They're lucky," he said. "So am I," she said, and meant it. The summer. The expanded operation ran. Its first full month was the summer Red Creek stopped being a town that was holding on and started being a town that was growing. The connection was not accidental. The cooperative drew traffic. The traffic meant business. The business meant families staying instead of moving on. Children in the unfinished church that was now being finished. a second general store going up on the east side of the main road. Nora Hensley, who had watched Eleanor with calculating eyes from behind her counter that first day, stopped Eleanor on the street in July and said, "I want to talk to you about carrying Dawson Ranch bread in the store." Eleanor looked at her. "I supply the railroad camp exclusively on bread," she said. "But Harriet Weston has surplus baked goods she hasn't found a market for. I can introduce you." Nora looked at her for a moment. "You're sending me to your cooperative partner instead of undercutting her to take the deal yourself." "The deal's not worth taking if it breaks something I've already built," Eleanor said. Nora was quiet. Then, "My husband said when you first came here that you'd be back on the wagon to Missouri in 3 months." She paused. "He owes me a considerable amount of money." Eleanor smiled. "Tell him to come by the stand sometime. I'll put in a good word." The letter from Missouri came in August. It was from Eleanor's younger sister, Clara, who was 22 and living in the same house they'd grown up in and had been writing Eleanor careful, affectionate letters every 6 weeks since Eleanor left. This letter was different from the others. It was longer. It circled around its own point for 2 full pages before arriving at it, which told Eleanor that Clara was struggling with something. She was. The house was going to be sold. Their mother had died in June, which Eleanor had already known from an earlier letter, and the estate was small, and the brother who held the deed needed the money. Clara had nowhere fixed to go. She had a skill set that was practical and undervalued. She could cook, keep accounts, manage a household, and she had their mother's instinct for growing things. She was not asking Eleanor for anything. The letter was very careful to not ask. But Eleanor was her sister, and she heard what wasn't written as clearly as what was. She read the letter sitting on the porch in the August evening, and then she went inside and told Caleb. He was fixing the pump handle, which had been giving trouble since the spring thaw. He stopped. He listened. She watched him process it. "How old is she?" he said. 22, Eleanor said. "Practical. Capable. The accounting she's done for the household would make you trust her with the ledger inside a week." He went back to the pump, worked the handle, tested it. "Holt's been talking about his knees," he said. "Says the cold is getting into them worse every winter." Eleanor looked at him. "Man who can't ride well in winter can still manage books, supply records, correspondence," Caleb said, adjusting the handle. "If there was someone else available to take on some of what Holt's been doing outside." "Caleb," she said. "What?" "You're offering my sister a position before I've even asked." He tested the handle again. It worked. He stood up and looked at Eleanor with that expression, the one she had learned to love with the specific love of something earned rather than given, the love that came from watching a person become more themselves in the time you knew them. "I'm saying there's room," he said, "if she wants it." Eleanor wrote to Clara that night. She wrote it fast, the way she wrote things when she was certain, not stopping to reconsider her phrasing. She told Clara there was a room in the back of the house, a good horse, work that was real and paid fairly and led somewhere. She told her that Wyoming winters were serious, and the mud season was not for the faint of heart, and the wind had opinions about everything. She told her to come anyway. Clara arrived in September. She stepped off the wagon in Red Creek in a way that reminded Eleanor painfully of herself arriving. The careful, held chin quality of a woman entering a place that didn't know her yet, deciding to let it find out. She was shorter than Eleanor, narrower, with their mother's hands, and a quick, observant quality to her eyes that Eleanor recognized as something that would serve her well out here. Caleb met them at the wagon. He took Clara's bag without being asked, which Eleanor noted with private satisfaction, and he said, "Welcome to Red Creek, Miss Whitmore. I'm Caleb." And Clara looked at him, and then looked at Eleanor with an expression that said she understood considerably more than had been written in the letters. "You didn't tell me he was like this," Clara said quietly when Caleb had gone ahead with the bag. "I told you he was honest," Eleanor said. "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Clara said. Eleanor kept walking, but she was smiling. Clara found her footing in 3 weeks, which was faster than Eleanor had expected, and exactly as fast as she'd privately hoped. She took over the ledger with the focused devotion of a woman who had found her natural medium. She reorganized the supply records in a way that made Eleanor's already organized system look approximate. She began corresponding with the cooperative farms directly, with Harriet Weston about egg production schedules, with Herman Schreiber about grain storage capacity, with Patience Ewan about seasonal variety planning. And all of them responded to her with the ease of people dealing with someone who knew what she was talking about. Holt, whose knees were indeed worse, and who had been managing the ledger with the stoic endurance of a man doing a job outside his natural abilities, handed Clara the account books with what Eleanor could only describe as visible relief. "You're good at this," he told Clara after the first week. "I know," Clara said, which was the most Whitmore thing Eleanor had heard since arriving in Wyoming. October brought the first inspection from the railroad company's regional manager, a formal evaluation of the expanded supply operation, the kind of assessment that came with a clipboard and a face accustomed to finding problems. His name was Patterson, and he arrived with 2 assistants and the official energy of a man conducting an audit. Eleanor met him at the gate. She had not dressed differently. She wore what she wore every day, working clothes, clean, practical, her hair up and her hands free, and her ledger under her arm. She walked Patterson through every element of the operation. The cold storage, which Caleb and the 4 men had rebuilt with limestone blocks and ice, and 2 months of careful engineering, and which was maintaining temperature within tolerances that made Patterson's eyebrows rise. The supply records, which Clara had made so clear and so organized that Patterson turned through them with the expression of a man who had been expecting to find problems and was experiencing the disorientation of finding none. The cooperative agreements, open to review, each farm's contribution documented, and each payment recorded. At the end, Patterson stood in the yard and looked at the operation as a whole. "How long has this been running?" he said. 14 months, Eleanor said. "From farm stand to what you're looking at now." He looked at her with the direct professional interest of a man who evaluated operations for a living and had just evaluated something that didn't match the scale of the timeline. "Who designed this structure?" "I did," she said. He wrote something on his clipboard. "The company is planning a 3rd camp, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "Next year, further east, significantly larger than the current operation." Eleanor looked at him. "How large?" 500 men, he said. "Possibly more at peak." The number landed in the air between them. Eleanor did not fill the silence immediately. She looked at the cooperative, at the cold storage, at the wagon routes she had mapped, and the farms she had knit together into something that functioned with the reliability of a machine built by people who cared whether it worked. 500 men. She ran the arithmetic fast and clean. The gaps it would require her to fill. The farms she'd need to bring in. The infrastructure adjustments. The timeline. "I'd want 18 months to scale appropriately," she said. "And I'd want the contract terms in writing before we begin the expansion, not after." Patterson looked at her steadily. "That's not typically how we—" "I know it's not typical," she said, "but I've built this by moving carefully, and I don't intend to stop doing that because the number got bigger. If the company wants what we've built here applied to a larger operation, we do it on terms that protect the farms that will be doing the work." Patterson was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something longer on his clipboard. "I'll bring it to the director," he said. "I'll tell him the operation is exactly what the contract claims, and the operator is exactly what the operation requires." He paused. "I'll also tell him that you'll be negotiating your own terms." "I always have," she said. He left. Eleanor stood in the yard after his wagon had gone down the road, and she felt the October air on her face. Cold, honest, the particular clean cold of a Wyoming autumn that had no interest in softening itself for anyone. And she thought about 14 months, about 18 cents in a jar, about a front yard full of decorative gravel laid with grief that she'd moved stone by stone in the dark before anyone else was awake. She thought about Caleb's hand on her sleeve in the dark yard the morning she left for Cheyenne. She thought about Clara's handwriting next to hers in the account ledger, the 2 Whitmore sisters making sense of numbers the way their mother had made sense of everything, quietly, accurately, without asking anyone's permission. She thought about Patience Ewan in her garden and Harriet Weston's hens and Tom Hadley's grudging handshake, and Joshua Alderman rebuilding a roof because it needed to be done and nobody had needed to ask him. She thought about old Pete and his 3 biscuits. She stood there until she heard boots on the porch, and she knew them before she turned. She knew the weight and the rhythm of them, the way she knew everything she'd paid genuine attention to. And Caleb came and stood beside her. He didn't ask what Patterson had said. He waited. "Third camp," she said. 500 men. They want us to expand. He was quiet for a moment. "Can we do it?" "Not the way we are right now," she said. "In 18 months, yes." He looked at the yard. At the garden, which had gone to fall preparation. The beds mulched and covered, the tools put away clean, the whole thing resting, the way good land rested before it offered itself again. He looked at the cold storage. At the stand, which was smaller now in relation to everything around it, but which Eleanor had refused to take down, because it was where it had begun, and she believed in keeping the beginning visible. 18 months, he said. "Maybe less," she said. "If Clara gets the new accounts organized by winter, and we bring in the Schreiber cousins on the South Grain route." He looked at her. She looked at him. Wyoming October was doing its work around them, stripping everything to essentials, reminding the landscape of what it actually was under the decoration of summer. "Eleanor," he said. "Caleb, I wrote the worst letter a man ever wrote to a woman," he said. "I offered you survival as if it was a proposal. I told you nothing about what kind of man I was, except that I was a struggling one. And you came anyway." "I came because you were honest," she said. "I can work with honest." "You've done considerably more than work with it," he said. She looked at the ranch. All of it. The stand and the garden and the cold storage and the herd in the far pasture and the smoke from the kitchen where Clara was already starting the evening meal and the wagon tracks in the yard from 14 months of before-dawn departures and honest returns. "Caleb," she said, "do you know what this place was when I arrived?" "Failing," he said, without flinching. "It was grieving," she said. "It was a man and a piece of land both holding on to the shape of something they'd lost instead of deciding what to become." She looked at him. "That's different from failing. Failing is when you can't. Grieving is when you won't let yourself yet." He looked at her for a long time. The thing in his face was the full version. Every wall gone, every careful management set down. Just him, looking at her, holding nothing back. "I let myself," he said quietly. "The morning you started moving stones before anyone else was awake, I was watching from the window and I thought, this woman came here to survive, and she's already doing something else entirely." He paused. "I didn't have a name for it then." "Do you now?" she said. "Yes," he said. She waited. "She came here to build," he said. "And she built me too, whether I was ready for it or not." Eleanor looked at him and felt the full weight of 14 months. Every dark morning, and every difficult conversation, and every decision made alone at a kitchen table in the hours before the world asked for anything. And she felt it settle, the way things settled when they had found the shape they were meant to be. She took his hand. "We're not done," she said. "Not even close," he said. 500 men, she said. 18 months. Clara on the accounts. Schreiber cousins on the south route. New cold storage by spring. "And Holt," he said. "He's not going anywhere, bad knees or not." "No," she said. "He's not." They stood together in the October afternoon, her hand in his, the ranch breathing around them. Alive, purposeful, building. And the road that had brought her here ran past the stand and past the garden and out toward the east where the new camp would be, and further than that, further than any of them could quite see yet, out toward whatever the next thing was going to be. Eleanor Whitmore had come to Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1884 as a mail-order bride to a man who needed help surviving. She had brought seeds wrapped in damp cloth and coins saved across 2 careful years and a ledger mind shaped by watching her mother hold a family together by pure force of attention. She had brought big hands and a bigger will and the specific knowledge, learned young and never unlearned, that the thing other people walked past without seeing was usually the thing most worth stopping for. She had not come to be saved. She had not come to be admired. She had not come to become smaller or quieter or more acceptable to the people who would look at the size of her and conclude they already knew the size of her. She had come to build. And she had built. A stand and a garden and a network and a community and a partnership and a marriage that had become, in the way the best things became, something neither party had known to want until they were already inside it. The decorative yard was gone. Every stone moved by her own hands before the sun came up on a morning when she had no guarantee anything would grow. In its place was everything that had grown. Rows and seasons and returns and expansions and 11 farms and 3 delivery routes and a jar above the stove that had stopped being a jar and become a ledger line. And beyond that, a story traveling out into the territory carried by every man who'd eaten her bread on a cold morning and felt, for the length of that meal, that someone had considered them worth feeding well. Eleanor Dawson was not a woman who had saved a ranch. She was a woman who had looked at a piece of failing land and a grieving man and a decorative yard full of buried soil and had known, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had always seen things clearly, exactly what they could become. And she had been right.